Please show your support with a like, subscribe, or contribution to either the YouTube or Patreon page. Coalitions and alliances crossing over borders in our new world. Note from the author. Please note that the following was initially written before the invasion of Ukraine, as well as the recent European and world events. Due to these many events, some issues and specific examples may have been put on the back burner in everyday conversations, but they are still nonetheless valid examples. Even though some examples may have passed, those underlying feelings that led to those events may still yet be present. We must concern ourselves with future events that may yet occur because of those underlying feelings. Thus, the main theme may be even more so important to future events and developments that have yet to occur. So, I believe it is important to remember that it is not necessarily the specific examples that should be at the forefront. I believe the recurring pattern itself causing new examples should be of most concern. Introduction. Many events have occurred these past years, but what about the future? While I can only speak for myself, I worry about the trials and tribulations that I see coming in the world. Like many, I have tried to warn the world before, but I feel that they have fallen on deaf ears. Choosing between incompetence, maliciousness, or self-centeredness. Why is it to me that the world seems to be dividing into two separate and extreme groups with some crossover? The group that puts themselves above all and anything else, eventually at any cost to others. Those self-centered, self-gratifying leaderships whose primary concern is for themselves or their cohorts. They have truly little concern for others or the future above their personal interests. Or the group that seems to be oblivious to human nature, who ignore the current realities of the world, human nature, or who are willing to ignore slothfulness. Both showing, obviously to different extremes, their obliviousness to the concerns of their own citizens, and both, in their own way, jeopardizing the future and the basics of survival or well-being of their own population as a whole. In my personal opinion, subjugation by autocracies and the sometime incompetent failures of democracies is not exclusively limited to national boundaries in this increasingly polarized world. Loss of faith in government. There seems to me a loss of faith and subversion of various and different societies, governments, and especially democracies as a whole in the world. The faith and the confidence of governments, especially democracies, around the world are being tested where it has never been tested before, and in some parts of the world, failing. Even in those countries that many may consider less democratic, there is a growing undertow of loss of faith of that government. But it is the loss of faith in the democracies in the world that I find most distressing. Redistributed coalitions and associations in the world. Note from the author. Again, this section was written before the invasion of Ukraine. Certain forms of traditional lines in the world are being tested. So much of our world these past years have become under question or fractionalized. Yes, you can still generally associate nations with other nations. However, more importantly, factions with traditional national boundaries are finding new alliances with their counterparts in the normally considered opposite nation. Cross-border alliances on all sides are increasing. National boundaries, in certain cases, are no longer absolute indicators of where opposing forces stand. It seems to me that there is a disruption to traditional unity within nations. Unfortunately, it appears to me that there are also forces forming to facilitate corruption and repression, not bound by national or cultural boundaries. There are those forces being coalesced to dominate, reduce freedoms and independence, as well as eliminate self-determination. Government, democracy, and threat. Note from the author. This section was written before the beginning of the coming together around the world to counter the actions in Ukraine done by the current Russian government. However, I fear that this coming together may only be a short-term reaction without significant long-lasting results due to it not being entirely based on morals by some, but on self-preservation. When I speak of democracy in the following, I am not limiting my discussion to one particular country or continent. Has the confidence in the democratic process faded in the world? Has the image of democracy become tarnished in the world as the functionality, results, or the very processes become under suspicion? I'm afraid for mutually beneficial democracies in the world. It appears to me that the overall strength of democracy in the world is disintegrating or at the very least diminishing. Many places where democracy once flourished or began to sprout have been fading in the world. In some parts of the world, even the facade of democracy has faded or disappeared altogether. Democracies throughout the world are being threatened or questioned. In some instances in the world, it is being rightly questioned. In other areas, unrightly so. But, on the whole, in consideration of the overall world, the threat towards democracy is increasing every day. They are becoming under threat from forces outside and within themselves. Some within democracies believe that there are forces within their ranks that want to subvert democracy. Some may be right in this belief, while others may be wrong in this belief. While others, such as extremists, have the belief that the current democratic process has become corrupt and itself is the threat. Democracies in many parts of the world and as a whole are under unprecedented scrutiny for their legitimacy. While in other parts of the world, even the hope for democracy is fading altogether due to the authoritarian movements. Some of those that are questioning the legitimacy of elections are found in my home country of the United States of America. I believe whether you agree or disagree with them is not the true problem. The true problem is the erosion of faith in democracy has gotten to the point that the illegitimacy can be so easily accepted by some. Subversion of democracy is happening both within and without what are normally considered democratic regions of the world. In various parts of the world, many believe that democracy is increasingly becoming suppressed. And in many countries, there are sweeping laws and actions being put into place, resulting in limiting or even purging democracy, such as local constitutional changes in some states within the United States and national changes to purge even the facade of choice, as in the installation of China's newly elected leader for life. In many other parts of the world, where there was once the hope of democracy, it is dying. There is a silver lining in that these situations can show and demonstrate how precious and fragile democracy really is, and how we must all take a stand for what we believe in. I believe that recent events in the world have shown us that we must remain vigilant in protecting the world from what has increasingly become under siege. Polarization has threatened peace around the globe. In my native United States, we have become even more polarized. I have considered myself an independent and even tried for political office as an independent. I have noticed as a nation and as a world, we have become even more publicly fractionalized in the traditional waves of coalitions and alliances. For example, anti-COVID sentiment that seems to cross borders on many countries and different continents. Even in those countries where these protests are not happening, there can be found a strong sentiment of mistrust in their government or their leaders on various sides for different reasons on the political spectrum. Strong vocal cross-border sentiment for and against various measures and reasons on many sides can be found. Whether you disagree or agree should not be the first concern. The issue that should be of first concern is the occurrence of discontent can be found in different countries and on different continents for varied reasons from both the left and the right of the political spectrum. Note from the author: because of recent events, I have felt the need to add this middle paragraph to this section as a supporting example. Recently, the international anti-invasion protests and sentiments against the Russian occupation of Ukraine could be considered examples of cross-border alliances and polarization. There is even visible opposition to the invasion of Ukraine even in Russia. And on the flip side, what appears to be pro-Russian sympathy by a few opinion commentators on some of the American news networks. In addition, what appears to be Russian-leaning politicians in my home country of the United States of America. Both of these sides could be indicators of cross-border alliances and polarization. We can even look at the international web of economics and the following of funds held by Russian oligarchs as examples of the prelude of coalitions, alliances, and polarization not constrained by national boundaries. These reasons and many more are why I believe that alliances across national borders are going to have more of a force in the future. In reality, there are governments facing many issues all over the world to ensure that there is opportunity for its citizens to supply themselves with self-sufficiency. Depending on whom you talk to, there are many sides that claim that the other has elements of a nation-state. Of course, some are more obvious than others. And I personally have observed in past experiences that those that can be most vocal can also be the ones that are trying hardest to hide these aspects within their own ranks. Some are also saying that there is also beginning to be a mix of these in different proportions on all sides. If this is indeed true, then this can only make it easier for extremists to exacerbate and utilize those negative elements, making us all forget to focus on actualizing those positive, mutually beneficial, and agreeable aspects to a more conducive future. Societies and governments under siege. Various societies and governments in many forms, including authoritarian, autocratic, and democratic, just to name a few, are under siege. I believe this is especially true and most disturbing for some democratic governments. One of the many ways in which democracy has become under threat is from those who would seek to control or subvert it for their own personal means or their followers' benefit, rather than the benefit of the whole society. There are efforts in many nations of the world so that those that are in power can stay in power. More than others, and justifiably, depending on your point of view or location in the world. There are individuals and groups of individuals in mostly all nations of the world and in vastly different forms of government attempting to change the rules, laws, and previously accepted norms to stay in power. There are forces attempting to silence opposition with public brazenness not seen in modern times. It could even be said that this is even more brazen considering that with our modern communication networks, the average citizen has vastly more opportunities of access to information in the world. Corrupt oligarchs, authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, or corruption with disproportionate power are seen by many, with some concerns much more legitimate than others. In many instances in the world, there are corrupt blocks of power with seemingly absolute power. Hunger for power at all costs can be especially dangerous with our modern capabilities. Security, democracy, separatism, extremism. Note from the author, this section was written before the invasion of Ukraine. I have noticed groups and governments around the world are even more emboldened in flexing their muscles for control and interference of others. Various societies, governments, and especially democratic governments are also under threat from those forces who would seek to control or subvert them within for their own personal gain or the belief of protecting a lifestyle or way of life. There are also those more willing to begin publicly rejecting and persecuting those that are different and think differently. Not only is this out of greed, but also perhaps out of some sort of fear. Many intentions at the time may be considered by some as necessary or justified. However, many of these courses often result in a very dark path. Yet the positive results of these situations is that it can inspire others to take a stand for what they believe in, where otherwise they would have remained silent. Those doing the intimidating are extremists from both the right and left of the political spectrum. Separatists also, for the good and bad, seem to be gaining more stringent and blinded followers on many sides. Some are also finding more and outlandish ways for justification of their actions. Violence from groups towards differing groups has increased, become more mainstream, or at minimum become more publicly visible. The slippery slope of the muddying of genocide and devalue of human life has visually increased publicly. There are also claims and denials by non-authoritarian and authoritarian regimes, with some claims without a doubt more verifiable and legitimate than others. There are also some who believe that their culture is under threat, many who believe that their independence is being lost, while others that feel that inequality is occurring. In yet other parts, it is the validity of the democratic process that is under question, or it has become viewed as a threat to a lifestyle or way of life. All of this has emboldened those believers that feel that it is their responsibility to save what they can by imposing their way of life on others. However, one core safety net that exists for the security to protect all is paying a price in their pursuit. In a real democracy, some may not agree with the current leadership, but at least there is a theoretical guaranteed opportunity for that leadership to change its direction. That sometimes marginal opportunity is significantly decreased or non-existent with the various forms of authoritarian and dictatorial leadership. We all must be more vigilant against extremism on both sides. We must not let extremism on either side derail us. We all can disagree, but I at least hope that we all have the right to express that disagreement. One common question that I ask is, what will those who genuinely believe do? Moreover, what are they capable of under the manipulation of those who are only disproportionately concerned about themselves? The pandemic's toll. From authoritarian to democratic governments, there are those that still believe that the pandemic is all a government farce, or at the very least the restrictions and reactions were overreached. Many believe restrictions and mandates at times were inconsistent, impractical, and sometimes overreached. At times they may have been correct. But the opposite argument could be made that it does not take a doctor to understand that when there is a sickness, a large crowd of people are breathing on each other in a confined space without some sort of protection, chances are that someone will get sick. It saddens me why common sense and the acceptance of the reality of human nature did not prevail on both sides from the beginning. Science was not listened to, and now it is too late for many. While COVID appears to be waning as I draft this, the true course, outcome, or long-lasting results have yet to be fully realized. My personal experience is not meant to belittle your experience. Many have had much greater tragedies, such as being parted from a loved one. I am just recounting my own personal validity and experience of the pandemic. While I was ill the first time when I had it nearly 2 years ago, I experienced slight vertigo and excess fatigue. For about 2 weeks, I had the same type of numbing sensation around the mouth and the nose that you would experience by receiving Novocaine at the dentist's office. This was the first and only time I experienced this sensation from being ill. While I still do have all the various sensations of tastes on my tongue and odors from my nose, I no longer have the sensations on my soft palate where I once had them. Before my illness, I had a sensation on the soft palate from the vapors of hot peppers, various odors, and it was extremely ticklish and sensitive. 2 years later, I no longer have any sensation in that area from vapors, and it is almost without sensation to touch. Darkness due to severing of communications on all sides from their perception of civil unrest. Note from the author. Please note that this following content was written and concerned situations before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Could the divisions in the world be the catalyst for another age of darkness, as nations, cultures, and civilizations in a moment of crisis become more isolated, competitive rather than cooperative? Authoritarian regimes seem to be making bold moves to become more powerful in the world. Are all of these pieces of a puzzle for us to consider that we are heading or moving toward another age of darkness? Even those governments that are considered less authoritarian seem to be more willing to selectively cut off their people from modes of communications with the rest of the world, and even sometimes within. Not only are those governments and organizations that are authoritarian, but those that would be considered less authoritarian are beginning to make moves to cut off communications of their population from the outside and within their spheres of influence. I am not debating if it may or may not be necessary to ensure public safety. I am just stating a fact that it is happening. But I can say that personal responsibility is something lacking in our modern world. Visible public civil unrest and distrust within and among existing governments seems to be not only spreading among those that are considered more authoritarian, but those that are also considered more democratic. In this, we need to be more concerned about those sentiments brewing that are not yet publicly visible. We must be more concerned about the growing different polarizations of political views and opinions. But more importantly, how the world will react to these new divisions and new forms of cross-border alliances and support on a global scale will be a true test for humanity and the future. And thank you again for your like, subscribe, or contribution to either the YouTube or Patreon page.